April 29, 1945, 11:20 hours, near Dachau, Bavaria, American sector. The woman was so thin her uniform hung like a shroud. She sat against a brick wall in the spring sun, her hands folded in her lap, waiting. Around her, the compound smelled of ash and disinfectant and something worse, something the wind could not carry away. An American sergeant approached, boots crunching on gravel. He stopped 3 feet from her and stared. She did not look up. He knelt down slowly and held out a canteen. "Drink," he said. She did not move. He set it beside her and said in broken German, "You're mine now." She thought he meant possession. He meant protection. The liberation of auxiliary camps near Dachau was not supposed to happen this way. The 45th Infantry Division had been pushing through Bavaria for weeks, and they had seen things that made even hardened men go silent. When they reached the cluster of smaller detention sites on the outskirts, they expected prisoners of war. What they found were ghosts wearing uniforms. Among them, Stabschelferin Margarethe Klein, 24 years old, formerly of the Luftwaffe Signals Corps. She had been captured 3 weeks earlier near Munich, swept up in the chaos of the collapse, and handed over to SS guards who did not know what to do with female auxiliaries and did not care to find out. She had been given no ration card, no medical attention, no acknowledgement that she existed. By the time the Americans arrived, she weighed less than 90 pounds. The sergeant's name was Joseph Harlan. He was 31, from Pennsylvania, a coal miner's son who had joined up in 1942 because he believed in something bigger than himself. He had seen Normandy. He had seen the Bulge. He thought he had seen everything. Then he saw Margarethe sitting against that wall, and he realized he had seen nothing at all. He did not speak German well. She did not speak English at all. But he understood starvation. He had grown up with it. And he knew, in the way you know things without words, that if he walked away she would die. So he did not walk away. She had been a volunteer once. Not an ideologue, just a girl from a small town near Dresden who wanted to do something useful. Her father had been a postal clerk. Her mother had died when she was 12. When the recruitment officers came to her school in 1941, she signed up because it seemed like the only way to matter. They trained her in Morse code and radio operation. They gave her a uniform that fit and 3 meals a day. For 2 years she believed she was part of something larger than herself. Then the bombs came. First the British, then the Americans. The signals unit was relocated 6 times in 8 months. By the end, they were working out of a cellar in Munich, routing messages for units that no longer existed. When the order came to evacuate, there were no trucks. She walked. For 3 days she walked west with a column of refugees and deserters and wounded soldiers who could not walk straight. On the 3rd day, American tanks appeared on the road. Everyone scattered. She did not. She was too tired to run. A military policeman took her papers, looked at her uniform and pointed her toward a truck. She climbed in. The truck drove for an hour and stopped at a compound. Wire fence, wooden barracks, guards with rifles. She thought, this is it. This is where it ends. But it did not end. It just became very, very slow. The transport from the auxiliary holding site to the main POW processing center took 2 days. Margarethe was loaded into a canvas-topped truck with 11 other women. Most of them auxiliaries, one a nurse, one a clerk from a supply depot. None of them spoke. The truck drove through villages that had been shelled into rubble, past fields cratered by artillery, past columns of American soldiers who barely looked up as they passed. At night they stopped at a field depot. The women were given water and a slice of bread. Margarethe ate hers in 4 bites and felt her stomach cramp. She had not eaten a full meal in 19 days. Her body had forgotten how. The nurse, a woman named Frida, older, steady, sat beside her and said, "Slow down. Your stomach will reject it." Margarethe nodded but did not slow down. She was too hungry to be careful. The next morning they continued. The truck passed through checkpoints manned by MPs who checked papers and waved them through without comment. At noon they arrived at a sprawling tent city on the edge of a forest. A sign at the gate read 7th Army Displaced Persons and POW Intake, U.S. Forces, Bavaria Command. The women disembarked. A lieutenant with a clipboard looked them over and said in accented German, "Inside. Processing starts in an hour." They were not told where they were. They were not told what would happen next. They were simply herded into a tent and told to wait. Sergeant Harlan had not been assigned to the intake center. He had been assigned to a supply depot 15 miles south. But he had put in for a transfer the day after he found Margarethe, and his CO, a captain who had seen too much death to argue with a man trying to prevent more, had approved it without question. Harlan arrived at the intake center on May 2nd, carrying a duffel bag and a letter he had written to his sister but had not yet mailed. He found Margarethi in the medical tent. She was lying on a cot, unconscious, and 4 lines running into her arm. A medic, a kid from Ohio no older than 20, was checking her pulse. Harlan stopped in the doorway. What happened? The medic looked up. Starvation. Dehydration. Possible typhus, but we're still waiting on the test. She collapsed during processing. Harlan stepped inside. She going to make it? The medic shrugged. Maybe. Depends on how much fight she's got left. Harlan sat down on an empty crate and stayed there for 3 hours. When Margarethi finally woke, she opened her eyes and saw him sitting across from her, elbows on his knees, watching. She did not speak. Neither did he. But he pulled a Hershey bar from his pocket, broke off a square and held it out. She stared at it. Chocolate. She had not seen chocolate in over a year. She took it, slowly, as if it might disappear. She ate it in tiny bites, tears running down her face, not from sadness but from something she could not name. He gave me chocolate, she wrote later in a diary she kept for 40 years. I thought I was dreaming. If this moment already changed how you see the war, subscribe, the next will surprise you even more. The American military's approach to POW treatment was not sentiment. It was doctrine, rooted in the Geneva Conventions, reinforced by field manuals, and enforced by officers who understood that how you treated prisoners reflected who you were. Soldiers, not animals. That was the line. It appeared in a directive issued by Eisenhower himself in 1944. The treatment of prisoners will be humane, consistent with security, and reflective of the values we fight to defend. It was not always followed perfectly. There were camps where conditions were poor, where guards were cruel, where the line between detention and punishment blurred. But the system as a whole held. By the spring of 1945, the U.S. held over 370,000 German POWs on European soil. Most were fed. Most were housed. Most survived. In a war where survival was never guaranteed, that mattered. The logic was simple. Security. Well-fed prisoners did not riot. Diplomacy. Your treatment of their soldiers determined their treatment of yours. Morality. Because if you won by becoming them, you lost something you could not get back. Harlan did not know the doctrine. He just knew that leaving someone to die when you could prevent it was not something he could live with. Margarethi spent 4 days in the medical tent. On the 5th day she was cleared to move to the general population barracks, a long drafty structure with rows of cots and a coal stove at each end. She was assigned a bed near the middle, given a blanket, a towel, and a bar of soap. A nurse handed her a tin plate and said, "Mess is at 0600, 1200 and 1800. Don't miss it." She did not miss it. The first meal was oatmeal, toast, and coffee. She ate slowly, remembering Frida's advice. The second meal was stew, beef, carrots, potatoes. Real beef. She cried while eating it quietly so the others would not see. Harlan appeared that evening. He knocked on the barracks door and asked for her by name. She came to the door, confused. He held out a pair of boots, women's leather, slightly worn but intact. "Yours are falling apart," he said. She looked down at her feet. He was right. The soles were split, the laces frayed. She took the boots. "Thank you," she said in German. He nodded and left. The next day he brought socks. The day after that, a jacket. She began to understand. He was not just feeding her. He was rebuilding her piece by piece. The days found a rhythm. Mornings, roll call, breakfast, work assignments. Margarethi was assigned to the laundry, easy work, the officers said, given her condition. She stood at a tub of hot water and scrubbed uniforms until her hands were raw. It was hard. But it was purposeful. And purpose, she was learning, was a kind of survival. Harlan visited most evenings. He brought small things, a comb, a pencil, a notebook. He did not stay long. He just knocked, handed her something and left. She did not know why he did this. She did not ask. She was too grateful to question it. One evening he stayed. He sat on the steps outside the barracks and gestured for her to sit beside him. She did. He pulled out a photograph, a woman with dark hair, smiling, holding a baby. "My sister," he said. He pointed at the baby. "Nephew." He looked at Margarethi. "You got family?" She nodded. "Father," she said in broken English. "Dresden." Harlan's face darkened. He did not say what they both knew. Dresden was gone. The firestorm had taken it in February. Margarethi had not heard from her father since. They sat in silence for a while. Then Harlan said, "You'll find him." After. She did not believe him. But she appreciated the lie. The letter. Margaretti was folding sheets when one of the other women, a former clerk named Latte, approached. "You have a protector," Latte said. It was not a question. Margaretti looked up. "What?" "The sergeant. Everyone's noticed. He brings you things. He checks on you." "Why?" Margaretti did not know how to answer. She settled for, "I don't know." Latte studied her. "Be careful. Men like that, they want something." But Harlan never asked for anything. He just kept showing up. "He asks nothing," Margaretti wrote. "That is what I cannot understand." One evening, someone started singing. It was Frida, the nurse, sitting on her cot, humming a lullaby. The others listened. Then, slowly they joined in. The sound filled the barracks, soft, tentative, human. Harlan was outside, smoking. He heard the singing and stopped. He stood there, cigarette burning between his fingers, listening. When the song ended, he crushed the cigarette under his boot and walked away. But the next night he brought a harmonica. He played 3 notes, badly, and handed it to Frida. "You're better at this than me," he said. She laughed. It was the first time any of them had laughed in weeks. Margaretti found a photograph in her jacket pocket, the one Harlan had given her. She did not remember him putting it there. It was a picture of a farmhouse, white clapboard, mountains in the background. Pennsylvania, probably. On the back in pencil, "Home." She stared at it for a long time. She thought, he is showing me what he is protecting. Not just her. But the idea of home. The idea that such places still existed. She kept the photograph. She kept it for the rest of her life. If you're seeing this war in a new light, subscribe. The next scene will challenge you even more. The shift was not sudden. It was cumulative. Margaretti had been told for years that the Americans were barbaric, that they would rape, pillage, destroy. She had believed this because everyone believed this, because to doubt it was to doubt everything. But the Americans did not act like barbarians. They acted like men who were tired and decent and trying to go home. They said please and thank you. They knocked before entering. They gave her boots and chocolate and a photograph of a farmhouse in Pennsylvania. The propaganda cracked. Not all at once. But slowly, like ice under spring rain. One day she realized she was no longer afraid. She was just tired. And tired was better than terrified. In June a chaplain arrived. He was a soft-spoken man from Texas who held a service in the mess tent. Margaretti attended not because she believed but because it was something to do. The chaplain spoke about forgiveness. About how mercy was not weakness but strength. About how the hardest thing in the world was to see your enemy as human. Margaretti thought about Harlan. About the boots, the chocolate, the photograph. She thought, he saw me as human when I could not see myself that way. After the service, the chaplain approached her. "How are you doing?" he asked in German. She thought about lying. Instead she said, "I'm alive." He nodded. "That's a start." In July Harlan was reassigned. He came to tell her himself. "I'm being sent to Frankfurt," he said. "They need me there." Margaretti felt something she had not felt in months. Panic. When? Tomorrow. She looked at him. He looked older than 31. The war had aged him. It had aged all of them. She wanted to say something, thank you, goodbye, don't go, but the words would not come. He pulled an envelope from his pocket and handed it to her. "My sister's address," he said. "In Pennsylvania. When you get out of here, if you get out of here, write to her. She'll help." Margaretti took the envelope. She did not open it. She just held it, feeling the weight of it, the promise of it. "Why?" she finally asked. "Why did you do this?" Harlan looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "Because someone has to." He left the next morning. Margaretti stood in the yard and watched the truck drive away. She did not cry. She had no tears left. But she held the envelope against her chest and thought, I will survive this. I will survive because he believed I could. Repatriation came in August. Margaretti was told she could return to Germany, to the Soviet zone where Dresden lay in ruins. Or she could apply for displaced person status and wait. She chose to wait. She spent 2 more months in the camp. She worked in the laundry. She sang with Frida. She wrote letters, to her father, though she knew they would never reach him. To Harlan's sister. To herself. In October she was transferred to a DP camp in Bavaria. She worked as a translator. Her English had improved, slowly, painfully. She met other survivors. She learned that her father had died in the firestorm. She cried for 3 days and then stopped crying and kept going. In 1947 she emigrated to the United States under a sponsored visa. Harlan's sister met her at the port in New York. She had never met this woman, but she knew her face from the photograph. The sister hugged her and said, "Joe told me about you. Welcome." Margarethi lived in Pennsylvania for the rest of her life. She married a teacher, had 2 children, and worked as a school secretary. She never spoke about the war. But every year, on April 29th, she lit a candle and thought about a sergeant who had knelt in the gravel and said, "You're mine now." She understood, eventually, what he had meant. Not possession. Protection. The promise that she would not be forgotten. That she would not die alone. That someone, somewhere, cared enough to see her as human. Harlan came home in 1946. He returned to the mines, married, had 3 children. He never spoke about the war either. But his daughter found a letter once, tucked inside an old Bible. It was from Margarethi, written in 1948. It said in careful English, "You saved my life. I will never forget." When his daughter asked him about it, he shrugged. "I just did what anyone would do." But that was not true. Most people would not have done it. Most people would have walked past that wall, past that dying woman, and kept going. Most people would have looked away. Harlan did not look away. And that made all the difference. The war had taught them fear. The camps taught them something else. Not forgiveness, that was too large, too neat. But restraint. Decency. The understanding that civilization was not a treaty or a flag, but a series of small acts, repeated daily even when no one was watching. A canteen of water. A pair of boots. A photograph of a farmhouse. These were not grand gestures. They were not heroic. They were simply human. And humanity, in the end, was the only thing that mattered. If this story reminded you that history is written in gestures as much as battles, subscribe. You'll find more truths here than in any textbook. Margarethi died in 2003. She was 82. At her funeral, her daughter read from the diary she had kept for 40 years. One entry, dated May 1945, stood out. "He gave me chocolate. I thought I was dreaming. But I was awake. And I was alive. And that was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything." The woman was so thin her uniform hung like a shroud. She sat against a brick wall in the spring sun, waiting. An American sergeant knelt beside her and held out a canteen. "You're mine now," he said. She thought he meant possession. He meant protection. And in that misunderstanding, in that gap between fear and mercy, the war finally ended. Not with a treaty. Not with a parade. But with a gesture so small, so ordinary, so profoundly human, that it became the only thing worth remembering. The war had taught them fear. The peace taught them mercy. And mercy, she learned, was not the absence of cruelty. It was the presence of someone who refused to look away.